So I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of New England up in Armidale, so I've had a fair drive to get down here, but as Amanda says, I'm also a research associate at the Australian Museum. So I'm one of the people who uses the collection. In my work I collect fish and give them to the museum, but also I look at the fish that are in the museum and try and conduct my research using those specimens. So I'm really excited about a load of fish, and the ones I'm going to talk to you about tonight are my very favourites. So a lot of the time I spend my life working on coral reefs, crystal clear, lots of fish out there. But the group of fish I want to talk to you about tonight, it doesn't matter whether you're on a crystal clear coral reef like that or diving under Tathrell Wharf yesterday. They're a group of small fish called cryptobenthic fish. So there's a really diverse assemblage of these tiny little fish. And like I said, it doesn't matter, they're all out there now. They're up all the way along the coast, all the way around the coast. Wherever you go, the average fish will probably be considered one of these fish that we call cryptobenthic. So you've heard the word cryptic floating around a few times tonight. It just means camouflaged, and benthic means living on the seabed. So cryptobenthic fish are camouflaged fish that live on the seabed. One of the things they are is really, really tiny. This is maybe real size or maybe a bit big, but pretty close. The other thing about them is generally wherever you go, on the wharf or up on the reef, there are lots of them. There's about, I think, 28 on this screen, and normally you'd find 28 often in a square metre. So something, a little bit smaller than the size of one of these signs. If you're out on a reef, you'd easily find 28, and down here you would be finding definitely 5 to 10, very commonly, often in some places much higher. So these little fish, these little cryptobenthic fish that I really like, they are really important, and structures like the wharf are really, really important habitats for them. But why do we care about tiny little fish? Even if there are a lot of them, realistically, if you're actually going to collect all the fish under the wharf in a bucket, the big fish would weigh, you'd get 10, 50, 20 kilos of big fish and like 150 grams of these. There's no weight of fish there. But the reason we care about these fish is that they do three things really, really well. The first thing they do is they grow. So this little fish, as you can tell, as I've said, I do most of my work on the reef, so I'm going to be using reef examples. This little guy, he's got a horrible name, he's called the adorned pygmy goby, or Eviota sigillata. They grow, when they settle on the reef, they grow about 50% of their body length. They increase by half again of their body length in about 10 days. So they grow ridiculously quickly. I mean, that's growing from this long to this long, but that growth is important. The second thing they do really well is they die. These guys die in ridiculous rates, and it's the same for the little fish you get off here. Their lifespans are some of the shortest lifespans of any vertebrates. In fact, this guy, the adorned pygmy goby, has the Guinness World Record as the shortest lived vertebrate. So these guys spend about 3 weeks floating around out in the open ocean as a larva. They then settle out onto the seabed where they're going to live their lives. They spend about 10 days doing that growth up to adulthood, and then they have 3 weeks. And in that 3 weeks they have to avoid dying, mostly, eat, find a mate to reproduce, sometimes change sex and reproduce again, and then they die. The thing about these fish is they don't just die, they get eaten. If you keep one in a fish tank, you can keep them alive for years. But if you go out in any ecosystem, whether it's here, whether it's on the reef, wherever you go, they will die by being eaten. But the thing is, these guys don't just necessarily get eaten by big thumping predators like this little rock cod here. I mean, this rock cod's almost 10 centimetres long. They die by being eaten by fish, only a little fish and invertebrates, only a little bit bigger than themselves. So I did some work recently, well, not that recently now, where I put the fish in tanks, and I put a load of the little fish in tanks, and I made an equivalent community as you'd find out on a reef. Left them for a few days and basically saw who had eaten who after a few days. And it turns out that this guy was really important in eating this guy. So an 11mm difference in length may change these guys from being friends to being food. So what we're seeing is that in these marine ecosystems, they're ridiculously complex. The food chains are really complicated. You're not having tiny fish eaten by much bigger fish. You have tiny fish eaten by slightly less tiny fish, eaten by slightly less tiny fish, eaten by medium-sized fish, and up and up and up. And the fish that you want to catch off the wharf have probably, eaten the equivalent of like 6 levels down the food chain to get back to these guys. But it's the cryptobenthic fish, these little tiny blennies and gobies and triple fins and the weed fish that Amanda and clingfish that Amanda showed lots of pictures of. These are the things that form the foundations of the food chain. So the question is, these things are forming a really important foundation, but how if you only live a few weeks? I mean, even the longest lived things, the things down here in the temperate zones, cryptobenthic fish tend to live a little bit longer, but they still won't live more than a year, definitely. But how do they survive if they're being eaten so regularly? So the third thing these things do really well is they reproduce. And one of the really exciting things about this group of fish is how they survive while facing such incredible predation rates. It's often the males that have some element of parental care. So most of the fish that you go out trying to fish, snapper, whatever you're looking at, they'll reproduce by sort of going out into the blue, spawning millions of eggs at a time, and they just wash out into the ocean. And if they wash back, that's great. That fish has done its job. But if you're a cryptobenthic fish, you've only got room in your body for a few hundred eggs. And if none of those come back, it's very low chance that they come back. You've died without reproducing, you've died without leaving a legacy, and your species will be declining in abundance. So in these guys, the males generally look after the eggs. So this is a little pipefish. You can see he's pregnant. So the females lay the eggs into his belly, and he'll guard them in a special pouch on his belly until they hatch. These guys are just basically straightened out seahorses. The seahorses are exactly the same. They've got pot bellies, the males are pregnant, and when the eggs hatch, they give birth, little fully formed seahorses come out, and that's the end of the parental care. They just look after it till eggs hatch. This is a cardinal fish, a male again. They guard their eggs in their mouths. You can see this one's almost ready to give birth, essentially. You can see all the eyeballs in the eggs, even through his jaws. The males in these species even have got specially adapted jaws that are big enough to allow them to breathe while they've got eggs in their mouth, which is a real benefit for these guys. So it's this parental care that means that they're much more successful at getting babies back to the reef, or back to the habitat they were born in. So these little fish manage to do these 3 things really well. They grow, they die, they get eaten, and then they reproduce, and they maintain this really abundant population of tiny fish that help support the entire food chain. So these little guys are more like a constantly replenishing jar of sweets on a reef. These are the little things, these tiny little fish, that we should really care an awful lot about. And it's habitats like the wharf that are really important to these fish.